Welcome to the Student Loan Planner Podcast. I'm Lauryn Williams, a consultant with the Student Loan Planner team since 2018. I can't believe it's been that long. Jeez Louise. I'm joined today by James Mwombela, one of the newest team members, and we are going to be discussing the racial wealth divide and how it's impacted the Black Americans' ability to create wealth. The basis of our conversation today is a Wall Street Journal article that was written last August called "College Was Supposed to Close the Wealth Gap for Black Americans." James, I know you took a deep dive into this article, so why don't we get started with you just kind of sharing your initial thoughts? And of course, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I'm glad that we're talking about this issue in this article because I found the findings of the article to be shocking, and I thought that a lot of our listeners might be shocked as well and be interested because we're all keeping up with student loans and, of course, the latest developments in the laws, but also how it's affecting society as a whole. And so this article came out last August, and like you said, it was in the Wall Street Journal. It was called "College Was Supposed to Close the Wealth Gap for Black Americans. The Opposite Happened." So here's one of the main numbers from the article that really captured my attention. So the median net worth for Black households with college graduates in their 30s is now $8,200. If you take that same statistic of net worth, but you look at Black households with college graduates in their 30s 3 decades ago, so it's the same group, it's just the people who are in their 60s now, let's look at them when they were in their 30s, their net worth was $50,000.
Wow, unbelievable.
Yeah, and if you look at white college graduates, the same white college graduates in their 30s today, their net worth is $138,000 compared to $118,000 for their cohorts 30 years ago. Now, all these numbers are in today's dollars, right? So Black college graduates 30 years ago who were in their 30s, their net worth wasn't actually $50,000 at that time because inflation has happened. So the actual number was a lot lower. But if you look at today's dollars, just to compare apples to apples, to compare it to today's number of $8,200, it was actually $50,000 for that group 30 years ago. So basically the same group, the same age group of Black college graduates, while 30 years ago they had $50,000 net worth, it's now gone down to $8,200 for today's cohort. So even though they did the same thing, they went to college, they worked hard, they did what they were supposed to do, they're doing much worse off from a net worth perspective, whereas young white college graduates are doing better. Now, we know Black people have started out way behind when it comes to building wealth, so we wouldn't have expected to have caught up by now, or maybe ever, but to be moving backwards compared to how Black people were doing 30 years ago, I found that to be alarming.
Yeah, and there's many studies out there that, have supporting evidence that, like you said, Black people as a whole are moving in the wrong direction. The stats actually state that by 2050, Black households will be headed toward will have a $0 net worth. So, we're currently at a positive net worth of the 8,200 you mentioned. Like I said, there's tons of different studies being done on this, but it is a little bit interesting because I think that, the overall way that we live life is like, okay, things are going better. There's more technology. There's more access to education. And, as we kind of live in our bubbles, they said, myself included, you would just think we're doing better as a whole. But in fact, the opposite is true. And so why is this happening?
Well, it probably would be helpful to just mention a quick refresher on net worth and what that means. Net worth is simply adding up someone's assets that they own, adding up their liabilities or their debts, and then subtracting the liabilities from the assets. That's their net worth. So when we say Black households today with college graduates in their 30s have a net worth of $8,200 compared to $138,000 for young white college graduates in their 30s, that's how you arrive at that number. It's their assets minus their liabilities. So why is this happening? Black college graduates are being affected on both sides of that net worth equation. So they have more college debt than the previous generation, and their income has stagnated. So although the cost of living has gone up quite a bit in the last 30 years, the income rise is not as much as we'd like to see. So let's look at the debt numbers first. More than 84% of college-educated Black households in their 30s have student debt. 30 years ago, that same group, black households in their 30s with a college degree, only 35% of them had student loan debt. So a lot more of them have student debt. And then we also owe more. So the younger generation owes a median of $44,000 in student loans compared to $6,000 for the same age group 30 years ago. Now, if you look at white college-educated households, 53% of them in their 30s have student debt compared to 27% 30 years ago. And then the amount that they owe is also more than it used to be, $35,000 compared to $8,000 30 years ago. And remember, all these numbers are in today's dollars. So you can see both the number of people that need to borrow for college and the amount that needed to borrow. It was actually similar for black and white households 30 years ago. The black households, they owed an average of $6,000 and 35% of them had to take out debt. And then on the white side, 27% of them had to take out debt and they owed $8,000 on average. So it was very similar 30 years ago. And today, both figures have gone up for both races. But what was surprising to me is the figures have gone up way more for black college grads. If you look at the difference between 30 years ago, way more black college graduates have to take out loans than white college graduates, and they also owe more.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, you're looking at these numbers and it's like, how do I decipher all these percentages and, numbers being thrown in my way? But it's that, more black people are going to college, still that more of them are also having to take on debt. So that to me is an indication that there is no scholarships being handed over. There is no parent that is able to pay for their college education. And so for the number of people that are taking out, there's far less white households that are needing to take on the debt, which might be why the number, 53% of the households are taking on student loan debt.
Versus 84% for young black households who had to take out debt. And you're absolutely right. It really comes down to everyone's working hard and deciding to go to college because we're all told to do that, right? But black college grads are just not getting as much help. So we know college costs have gone up for everyone. But in 2012, 64% of white families contributed to their kids' education, and they contributed an average of $73,400 towards their children's education. On the flip side, only 34% of black families were able to help their kids, and they provided an average of $16,000, which, depending on the school, that could cover a semester, maybe. And so the rest has to come from scholarships, hopefully, financial aid, and the rest comes from student loan debt.
Yeah, I mean, that's showing the discrepancy there is that people are not able to save as much or to be able to put as much toward their education, which is leading to, I want you to go to school, I want you to better yourself, but also you got to figure out how to do it on your own because this is, I can only contribute a limited amount or maybe none at all, depending on, the circumstances of that household.
And this hits home because my parents didn't have a whole lot of money to contribute to my college education, and I knew that going into it. And I got fortunate because I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Go Heels. We just lost the championship, but I'm still proud of them. It was a great season. Anyway, UNC is consistently ranked as one of the top value colleges in the country in terms of the quality of the education versus the cost. And even though I was attending out of state, I received $10,000 a year from the DC government to attend because we don't really have a state school. That's a benefit that I got as a DC resident. And so the out-of-state tuition, especially when I was going, to today it's a lot higher. But when I was going, the out-of-state tuition was just not as bad as a lot of other schools, especially private schools. Once you add the assistance from the DC government and the financial aid I got, I only had to borrow like $13,000 for school. And so even though my parents weren't able to contribute as much as others, I ended up making I think a pretty sound financial decision when it comes to where I went to school. And so that ended up helping me out. But if I went to a private school or something like that, I might have been in a lot different boat. So, Lauren, what about you? Did your parents help you to pay for your college costs?
No, if I had not had opportunities for academic or athletic scholarships, I would have been trying to fund my education wholeheartedly. with financial aid and student loan debt. So I was fortunate to have gone to the University of Miami on a track and field scholarship. And I was also eligible for some academic scholarships as well. I got into Brown and some other cool schools, Cal Berkeley. Rice was at the top of my
I didn't know
list.
you got
Yeah.
into those schools. Look at you.
Yeah, but I chose University of Miami because at 17 years old, it was like, hey, if I'm going to have to run around the track in order to get this free education, I better go somewhere warm. And turned out to be the best decision I ever made. So I think not one day did I ever regret my decision to go to the University of Miami, but I definitely am a part of the conglomerate of people who would not have had any assistance from my family to be able to. And I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, so no
Oh,
one
wow.
got any of their college paid for. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. You said 5 sisters and 2 brothers, so it's 8 of y'all.
Yeah, we roll deep. Right.
Yeah, I guess all the college money was spent on raising y'all through childhood, I guess.
Right. Keeping a roof over our head, keeping us clothed and clean, and yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it shouldn't be that surprising that the previous generation, our parents' generation, on average, doesn't have as much money to pay for our education, right? Because a lot of people look at racism and they say, oh, it was so long ago. But if you look at it from a generational standpoint, our parents were born in the 60s, right? When were your parents born?
Yeah, 50s even. My mom is 50, was born in 51, and my dad maybe like late 50s. So he's a little bit younger than her, but
If you look at Black millennials, our parents were born in the 60s or in your case, sometimes earlier. And so their parents or our grandparents, they really had it rough with discrimination and racism, right? And so that, of course, impacted our parents' upbringing, which would impact our parents' ability to earn income and build wealth. So although many of our parents were able to live better than our grandparents, it may not have been quite to the same comfort level as it would have been if their parents hadn't gone through as much discrimination as they went through. And they may not have had the same financial mindset and habits of building wealth and setting up the next generation for success as a lot of white parents of the same generation had.
yeah, and I think another thing we should talk about is, the idea of like income. Income growth is another thing that is a big deal. So, we look at the other side of this. It's the median income for Black college educated households in their 30s has increased from 71,000 30 years ago to 76. So, moving on up. But the income of their white counterparts rose from 100,000 to 114,000. So, and I know one of the things that I've experienced, we get an inside look as financial planners. We see so many different people, so many different backgrounds, so many different professions, and so many different incomes. And especially, being a part of the student loan planner team, that's one of the things that we're privy to is, how much a physician of this particular expertise is making versus a physician of the other, different states, different parts of the country, et cetera. But, I've also been able to see as part of my financial planning practice and SLP, some of those disparities. And, over time, the more calls that you do, the more consultations, the more people that you work with, you can truly see. For me, it's been in tech. The Black clients that I've worked with that are in tech are not earning the same amount as white clients in tech. And so you become exposed to the information, but then, what do I do with it? How do I tell, one client like, hey, I think you should go ask for more money. I don't really have the clear, I can't tell them why I think you should ask for more money, or, you're not sharing information across clients. But at the same time, the more information I'm able to gather, the more that I realize that this is not, just being made up, or it's not a narrative in articles, but it is something that people are actually living.
Oh, I'd have no problem sharing information across clients. I mean, of course, not saying names or talking about clients specifically. I have not run into this personally myself. But I'd have no problem telling a Black client, look, you're being underpaid. I don't have to say anything else. I can just be like, you're being underpaid. I know how much people make in your industry for your job level and your amount of experience. You're being underpaid. You should probably be paid about X amount. I would just leave it at that.
Absolutely right. I think, but there's also this like idea that, it's kind of like, well, I don't know. And it's like, no, I know, but like, it's like, well, how do you know? You don't work in tech, Lauren, and then you kind of go down that rabbit hole of, how far do you go to explain?
That's true. That's a good point.
And, like I said, at what point are you, crossing a line to And I mean, ultimately, a lot of times it's like you don't know even when you know. So it's really tough to kind of encourage people to go out and ask for more, ask for what you're worth. When income in and of itself is a very objective thing, and that's something I've seen even with women. I went to a seminar once, and they were talking about the idea that women will not apply for a job if they see one thing on the list that they are not qualified for. There's a criteria what you should have, whereas a man will not qualify for any of them and will still sign up for the job and go about the process. It's just like a difference in mindset overall. So we've got to do something to be able to change what people think they're allowed to ask for.
I've seen that with my wife. It's really funny. Exactly what you described. I've seen that with my wife. I would say I'm probably a little more maybe conscientious than the average man, in that I'll also look at the qualifications, and I'll aim to meet all of them and before I feel really good about applying. But I'll still apply if I don't meet all of them. And whereas my wife would not apply at all if she doesn't meet, most or all of the qualifications. And I find it funny that I've actually seen that happen live, that difference in mindset when applying. So taking it back to the article, Lauren, you talked about the numbers when it comes to the slow income growth. So taken all together, what's happening is Black college grads in their 30s have larger debt balances than the previous generation, and their incomes just hasn't grown as much as we'd like to see. Compared to the cost of living, it just hasn't been much of an increase at all. So what does that really mean for their lives? Well, there's less money available to save and invest, right? If you have more of your income going towards making student loan payments and your income hasn't grown as much as others, well, there's less money available to set aside and build wealth. There's also less money available to afford to buy a home. So you not only have to deal with having a larger debt to income ratio, and so you may not qualify for the home in the neighborhood that you want, but of course you have more of your income going towards student loans, so not as much income to save for the down payment or to afford a mortgage in the neighborhood that you want. And so what we've seen is about 41% of Black college-educated households in their 30s own homes, compared to 67% among their white peers. And I found that to be alarming because in terms of American society and the way things have gone for previous generations, we really want to see people owning their first home in their 30s, right? That's kind of a milestone for owning your first home. And buying that first home is critical because, like, for instance, look at today's housing market. If you already have a home in today's housing market, you probably have a lot of equity. Even if you bought the home 2 years ago, you probably already have good equity. Just the explosion we've seen in the housing market. And so guess what you can do with that equity? You can leverage that to help you afford the next home. When you sell that, you've got proceeds there that you can use to help afford the next home. And we've seen that happen for past generations. But let's say you never got that first home. Well, now you're trying to buy a home at today's expensive prices without the boost that comes from selling your first home. And you might just be priced out. Instead, you're paying rent that's going up every year instead of locking in a fixed mortgage payment. And maybe you can't afford to live in the neighborhood that you like. Maybe that neighborhood that you end up living in doesn't have as nice of a school district. And that impacts your children's education, right? Because we know that property taxes go into funding the schools. So if you can't afford the nicer neighborhood with the higher property values, that could impact your children's education. And see how this just goes on and on, all from this higher student loan balance?
Yeah, and I'd say too, I mean, one other kind of thing we need to throw into the pit of what's holding people back is just financial literacy. Good old fashioned not knowing what to do, how to buy your first home, not knowing how to get started with the saving and investing piece, because you don't come from a background where someone was talking about that. So if there was less income in your household, like I said, I have 5 sisters, 2 brothers. My father was ill, so he was on disability for much of my upbringing. There just wasn't a lot of income to go around. Like you said, when you're in survival mode, even though our parents are telling us to go to college and they're wanting something better and we're getting more opportunity because we're college educated, there's financial literacy is just lacking because they didn't have literacy. So literacy was not passed down. And what I've seen and felt quite a bit in my personal community is people being susceptible to narratives. Social media is very powerful now, and there's lots of get rich quick schemes out there. There's lots of, give me $5,000 now and I'll turn you into a millionaire tomorrow sort of thing.
I just hit platinum status. Look at me. Don't you want to be like me? Don't you want to quit your day job?
Yeah, and it's a lot of keeping up with the Joneses, C and B scene. And so, some of the better incomes that are coming in are being redirected to the wrong places simply because there's no literacy. There's not a community of people to, have positive conversations about how to move forward financially and close the gap, whether it be the racial wealth gap or the personal wealth gap that you're feeling. I think it's so much because it's like your hair is on fire. You feel like you're far behind. You're becoming aware of the fact that there is this gap. And then you're like, how do I catch up? I think of it, I'm a sports person. So, you run the race, you train all season, you do all the things you need to do. Or, there's the person over here that goes and gets some really fancy performance enhancing drugs. And now they're instantly fast. Like, can you become instantly fast? You can, but the likelihood of you staying instantly fast, not giving yourself some sort of disease that's going to kill you, it's going to implode. And also it's illegal to become quote unquote instantly fast. The get rich quick schemes or to get where you want to go really quickly usually ends up in you burning down a bridge and setting yourself back even further, which is why I believe that the numbers for net worth are heading in the wrong direction, despite some things being better overall.
Yeah, the get rich approach ends up biting you, right? And that's why both of us got into financial planning, right, Lauryn? I mean, we both, once we encountered the challenges that come with managing your own finances and discovered the tools and the strategies to do it well, we were like, this is amazing. And we've never heard of this before. And we saw that many people in our communities haven't heard about it either, even if they're making a lot of money, like you said. And so we said, hey, we're going to bring this message to them. We're going to bring the good news, right?
Exactly. It is not for lack of effort. So for sure, we are fighting a good fight out here. All right. So let's just summarize what we've discussed so far. Give us a rundown of where we've come so far in this article.
So here's the deal. When we say the median net worth of Black college grads in their 30s is $8,200, we calculate that from assets minus liabilities. And so we're seeing negative impacts on both sides of that equation. Larger student loan balances, which is a liability, and then we're seeing slower income growth, which leads to fewer opportunities to build assets, including homeownership. And so Black college grads in their 30s are falling behind during a crucial time in their lives. And one thing that I thought about is we've read and heard a lot of experts saying that millennials aren't doing as well financially as previous generations, right? How many articles do you see talking about that?
Oh, tons.
And our listeners have probably seen those articles too. And I'm sure that's true if you look at the generations as a whole, right? Because both generations, millennials and baby boomers, they'll include people without college degrees. There's no question that it's tougher today if you don't have a degree than it used to be. So that's why if you look at everyone together, millennials as a whole maybe aren't doing good. I think a lot of the gap is people who don't have college degrees. But if you look deeper at the numbers, well, let's just look at people with college degrees, the baby boomers and the millennials. What you see is white millennials who have college degrees actually have more wealth than their baby boomer counterparts. Their median net worth is $138,000 today, compared to $118,000 for baby boomers when they were their age. But young Black college grads have much less wealth than their baby boomer counterparts did at their age. Again, $8,200 compared to $50,000. And so this is a big deal when it comes to, when we talk about the American dream, right? College education is seen as something that can set you on the path to prosperity. And we tell kids to do that. A lot of people tell Black kids that specifically. Do that as a way to pull yourself up and narrow the racial disparities. We were all told that as kids. And then also, I think in America, we want to see subsequent generations doing at least as well as the past ones, preferably better. We want to see things get better with each generation. And so if you look at both of those measures for society, how well is college helping people reach prosperity? And are the future generations doing better than the previous? In both areas, it's just not working out for Black people who went to college. So I just think that it's important for us to be aware of this.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that we're shedding a lot of light on some considerations that, like you said, things I didn't know before reading this article, and I'm sure that listeners are were not aware of, and how we figure out solutions. But I think even before we talk solutions, maybe we should talk a little bit more and provide some context for those who may not be as aware of, the history of the racial wealth gap. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think this is important because when we talk about things like parents being able to afford to send their kids to school, where does their wealth come from to do that? And so you got to go back in order to have an idea of why some families don't have that wealth and others do. So the racial wealth gap is something that I'm sure our listeners have been hearing more about these days than in the past. And so I want to talk about several historical events that we may not have learned about in school, but that had an impact on how much wealth white families have today versus black families. I want to go all the way back to slavery, specifically the Special Field Orders number 15, which were military orders issued during the Civil War in 1865 that ordered the confiscation of land in the South to be provided to formerly enslaved families. This was actually done for some coastal lands in South Carolina and Georgia. So this is actually where the term 40 acres and a mule come from, if people have heard of that, because it provided for 40 acres per family who had fought in the war and had gained their freedom. But actually, after President Andrew Johnson was elected following Lincoln's assassination, he ordered the military to seize this land back from the freed black people and return it to the original Southern landowners after they took an oath of loyalty. So look this up if you haven't learned about this before. This absolutely happened. So think about how much that land is worth today compared to its worth at that time. And this was a huge opportunity missed to actually give black people a leg to stand on right after slavery when they had nothing, right? They had spent their whole lives working to build wealth for other people and build wealth for the country as a whole. And if you think about today's standards of justice, I bet most people would agree that it would have been absolutely the right thing to do for the federal government to seize land from people who took up arms against the United States government and were rebels, seize some of their land and give it to these people who had been working on it their whole lives so that they can actually have something to support their families. And just that would have radically changed the distribution of wealth today.
And as I think about that, it's like you said, it always goes back to property, real estate, ownership, etc. The thing that came around right behind that was redlining, where black families were denied the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership. So it was basically like enforced segregation in neighborhoods. And sometimes people are saying it's still happening even today. And that segregation has led to black families having the homes that they do own have a lower value. Do you have any commentary around like the idea of redlining?
This is another thing that we probably didn't learn about in school, but homeownership, we all have learned is part of the American dream, and its access to homeownership was greatly expanded in the 1940s and 50s following New Deal legislation. But what we may not learn about is that the federal government, they literally drew a red line through certain neighborhoods that they deemed to be high risk for home loans. And as you might guess, a lot of those neighborhoods were black, or almost all black neighborhoods were redlined. And banks were afraid to loan money to who wanted to buy homes in these neighborhoods, and were openly discriminating against black people. And so black families were actually excluded from becoming homeowners for a long time until federal legislation in the 60s made these practices illegal. And then black people started to buy homes in larger numbers. But of course, that was after 30 years or so of being openly excluded. So having to buy homes at larger values now, larger values compared to where it was 30 years ago. But also because of segregation, and you see this clear difference between the homes owned by white people and homes owned by black people, and what people thought about the neighborhoods, was once they did own the homes, their homes actually lagged the homes in the white neighborhoods in terms of the value growth over time. And so, according to the Brookings Institute, to even today, median home values in majority black neighborhoods are 55% lower than in white neighborhoods. And we talked earlier about where funding in public schools comes from, right? Property taxes. And if property taxes are based on the value of the homes, now we see education inequality. So redlining is another important event in American history. And then if you fast forward to 2008 housing market crisis, at this point, Black people actually had gained more access to home ownership, but a disproportionate amount of their wealth was in their homes. So when the bubble burst and home values plummeted, it hit Black families harder. And so this is what we see over and over is someone isn't necessarily nefariously targeting Black people with racist intent. Even race-neutral events like increasing college costs or, for the most part, the 2008 financial crisis, these events hit Black people harder than white people because of past racism in the last century and before. The effects of those events are still here.
Woo, that is a lot. But it does provide a lot of perspective overall what is causing the racial wealth gap. And I think it is an important piece of context to help people understand why this is a thing. Because we definitely know that there are people of all sorts of income levels and various races that are struggling financially for various reasons. But, this is a very specific problem that I know lots of people are now looking for solutions to. And so I think it's actually a great time to, let's talk solutions. What can we do about this?
Well, I know student cancellation is a thorny topic. Should we have it? If we did, how much debt should we cancel? Who should get it? Should everyone get it, or should only certain people get it? Well, what about the people who were responsible and they paid off their loans, right? What about them? So I'm not going to get into all that, and I'm not going to build an argument for or against cancellation. But I can say that there has been discussion within the Biden administration about possible student loan cancellation on a broad scale, and that would improve the situation we've discussed today. For instance, let's say the Biden administration announced that everyone would have their first $50,000 in student loans wiped clean. Well, since the median debt for Black graduates in their 30s is $44,000, over half of them would no longer have debt, and the rest would have more manageable debt balances. So the people who need relief the most would get it. People who we see who maybe they just have a bachelor's degree and they're not making as much money as they hoped, and their debt to income ratio is really undesirable. Whereas people with larger debt balances who would still have debt to pay off after that first $50,000, they're more likely to have graduate and professional degrees and hopefully larger incomes that come with that will still put them on the path to pay off the rest of their debt and build wealth. So this may not do much for the racial wealth gap between white college graduates and Black college graduates, unless it could potentially allow Black graduates to buy homes sooner than they otherwise would. And we've talked about how important that has been for wealth building in American history. I mean, there are probably some college graduates out there who their money for college literally came from their parents selling their grandparents' home when they died, right? That's why homeownership is so important here. And so that could actually be a way to narrow the wealth gap a little bit if Black college grads are able to buy homes earlier than they otherwise would. But I'll say, even if broad cancellation doesn't improve the racial wealth gap, it could at least allow Black college grads to be more on par with previous generations when it comes to building wealth. And that's at least what we want to see, right?
Absolutely. I think you bring up some really good points. And of course, I know that on one end, there are people who are just like, man, like $50,000 wouldn't help me at all. And I really need help. I think you brought up a really good point in the idea that 50,000 is not going to wipe it out for a lot of people. A lot of our listeners have high six-figure student loan debt. And so some of them feel like it's not going to make a difference. And I think one of the biggest problems with them even introducing the idea of cancellation is, how do we make it somewhat fair? Like you said, what about the people who already paid off their debt and, they're angry, or they've been working on it all of the pandemic and, whittling it down, and they only got 20,000 left, and they might have been eligible to get 50,000 forgiven. There's coulda, woulda, shouldas. We can't all benefit equally. And, there's like, so what about the people who never had it? Yeah, I didn't have student loan debt. It's not one size fits all in the sense of how, anything that will be distributed will equally benefit everyone. But I think we need to focus on the idea of helping those who need it the most and what is overall good for our society. I can think of, someone I just talked to recently who would be on the, on the poopy side of this, if you will. A physician who, like I said, stereotypically we say has great earning potential and great income, This person had $400,000 of student loan debt and was earning $38,000 because of their particular circumstances. So, like I said, it is not just that, like you said, while in general, people will have higher degrees, have higher income, etc. We know that there will be some people left out. I think, though, we need to focus on, if we're on the quote unquote left out side of things, how does this overall help society? How is this moving the needle for everyone and making this a better U.S. economy overall, if that possibility does come down the pipeline?
Absolutely. And there could be other solutions that we're not even thinking of that would be even better. That's why I think it's important for us to at least have this conversation and for people to be aware of what's really happening on the ground when it comes to student loans, because then that can inspire someone else to come up with an even better solution. I mean, I know there's been some indications that student loan planner content is actually influencing education policy at the highest level, right? And maybe we can go more into that in another episode. But suffice it to say, whoever's listening, whoever's taking in our content, maybe this can get some gears turning in the heads of people who actually impact what happens in the future. And maybe they'll think of something even better. But we can't think of the solutions until we talk about what's really happening.
Yeah, and I think the conversation is, like you said, the key aspect and a very, very important first step, which is why I enjoy doing these podcasts, so that we can disseminate information to people overall to be more educated, have a broader perspective, and then also be, like I said, better equipped to be able to help themselves, because some of the information just wasn't passed through a parent or a friend, or, there's just not the resources directly within someone's circle. But thank goodness for media outlets like podcasts and blogs and things like that can help people better educate themselves.
We've thrown a lot of numbers at you when it comes to debt owed and income earned, and what it boils down to is the people who are having the most difficult time with this are people who don't have a favorable debt to income ratio. So they owe a lot relative to their debt. Their debt may be 100% of their income. It could be up to 150% of their income or more. And so for those people, it's really important to have a personalized plan for how you can pay as little as possible. And of course, it depends on your budget, right? So if you owe, let's say you owe $80,000 a year and you're making $80,000 a year, if you're a really good budgeter, it might make sense for you to pay off every dollar. But if you're struggling or your debt ratio is less favorable than that, you're really a good candidate for paying as little as possible into your debt and having the rest forgiven. And the rules around exactly how to do that are very complicated, and it varies person to person. And so person A's unique mix of loans calls for a much different strategy than person B's mix of loans. And so for those people, I would say definitely, keep educating yourself and reach out to us if you want to actually have a personalized plan built for you for how you can pay as little as possible into your loans and pursue forgiveness so that you don't have to let this get in the way of important milestones in your life, like buying your first home or having a child.
Hopefully you all are feeling inspired by what we've shared today, pumped to get your own personal student loan plan in order. You can always find us at studentloanplanner.com. We're doing 60-minute consultations. We are now a party of, are we 8, James, or 6?
We're 8 now.
We are a party of 8. So 8 consultants ready to help you figure out your student loan strategy. In just 60 minutes, we can do something that is really, truly life-changing. And having been here since 2018, I've seen lives change in just 60 minutes. So don't be afraid to invest in yourself in a consultation if you feel like that's the next step after educating yourself with podcasts and blogs and such. Thanks for joining us for the Student Loan Planner Podcast.